So to answer that second question, the adrenal medulla releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine produces a much more diffuse response than if we have one preganglionic neuron talking to another preganglionic neuron. Releasing of that neurotransmitter into the blood produces a much more diffuse response. Any questions on that? I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's go back here. So that question was, which of the two divisions produce the more diffuse response? And we said the sympathetic, specifically the adrenal medulla. All right. Okay, let's move on. So objective 2 is to talk about the chemical messengers and the receptors that are associated with the peripheral nervous system. All right. So first of all, we're going to talk about two types of receptors. We talk about cholinergic receptors and adrenergic receptors. These are the two main receptors that are involved in the autonomic nervous system, right? In fact, the entire peripheral nervous system, both somatic and autonomic. So the first one is the cholinergic. These neurons secrete acetylcholine. This is something that we saw last, our last material that we looked at. This is on your last test. What type of neurons secrete acetylcholine? And these are your cholinergic neurons, and cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine. Adrenergic receptors, on the other hand, bind norepinephrine. Now, I have hormone in the brackets because we mentioned that norepinephrine can be a neurotransmitter if it's at the synapse, but when norepinephrine enters the blood, it becomes a hormone. Okay? So, that is the two types of receptors that you have. Let's talk about the neurons or the neurotransmitters. So we spoke about preganglionic neurons, and all preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine. That's something I want you to make a note of and stick it in the back of your head. All preganglionic neurons, whether they are on the parasympathetic side or on the sympathetic side, they all secrete acetylcholine. Postganglionic neurons, on the other hand, will secrete acetylcholine only if they're in the parasympathetic division. So the parasympathetic division, postganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine, whereas on the sympathetic side, the postganglionic neurons secrete norepinephrine. All right? And then finally, we have hormones of the adrenal medulla, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Right, so these are just like the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, which secrete norepinephrine. The only difference is, and I'll continue to mention this over and over, when that norepinephrine enters the blood, coming from the adrenal medulla, it now becomes a hormone. I have two stars next to the sympathetic side here because there's one exception to this rule. So we said that all sympathetic postganglionic neurons secrete norepinephrine, and there's one exception, and that is your sweat glands. So the postganglionic neurons that innervate your sweat glands, the sympathetic neurons, will not secrete norepinephrine, right? And that's a small exception. You don't really have to know that. I'm not going to test you on that. That's just a FYI. Alrighty. Now, a lot of students get confused at this point because we have two divisions of the nervous system we're talking about, and then each division has two neurons. So we have a preganglionic neuron on the parasympathetic side. We have a postganglionic neuron on the parasympathetic side. And we have the same two neurons on the sympathetic side. All right? And the take-home message here is that all preganglionic neurons will secrete acetylcholine, whether they are sympathetic or parasympathetic. Whereas the postganglionic neurons on the parasympathetic side, they will secrete acetylcholine as well. Whereas the postganglionic neurons on the sympathetic side will secrete norepinephrine. Ready? All right, let's move on. So this image just sort of recaps that. We have our three routes of communication, right? Going on to the sympathetic chain, synapsing onto the adrenal medulla, and then synapsing onto a collateral ganglia. As we can see here, all of these neurons in blue, these are all preganglionic neurons, and they all secrete acetylcholine. On the sympathetic side, on the postganglionic neuron, they all secrete norepinephrine, right? Even this chromaffin cell, which we're going to consider a postganglionic neuron, it also releases epinephrine, but bear in mind this becomes a hormone, whereas at the neuroeffector junction here, it's still a neurotransmitter. So it's a neurotransmitter in 2 out of these 3 routes of communication. So the message here is that all your preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine, and then your postganglionic neurons on the sympathetic side secrete norepinephrine. Let's look at the parasympathetic division. Again, our preganglionic neuron will secrete acetylcholine, but our postganglionic neuron is also secreting acetylcholine. All right, so all the neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system will secrete acetylcholine. All right, let's talk about types of cholinergic receptors. There are 2, nicotinic cholinergic receptors and muscarinic cholinergic receptors. And this ties back into something that we talked about before. We talked about ionotropic receptors and metabotropic receptors. Does anyone remember what ionotropic receptors were?
Fast.
They're fast receptors, perfect. And that's because
they had a channel.
Right, perfect. The receptor acts as a channel. All right, so we have a ligand, bind to that receptor, and that opens up a channel immediately. This gives us a faster response. Now, the nicotinic cholinergic receptor is ionotropic. And as a result, it's going to be much more faster. It's going to bind a ligand, right? Acetylcholine will bind to this nicotinic receptor. It's going to open up a cation channel. Sodium, or let's say calcium, will rush into that cell, and that will cause depolarization. So this is your ionotropic type of receptor, faster response where the receptor acts as a channel. Muscarinic receptors, on the other hand, are what we call metabotropic. This is something that we looked at before. What is a metabotropic receptor?
It's a receptor that doesn't have a channel.
Okay.
And it's slower.
Slower response.
It's slower response, and it releases proteins that get amplified.
Good. So we have an amplifier enzyme, and we have proteins, which we call second messengers, right? So we have G protein coupled, or proteins coupled to this receptor, which will then stimulate an amplifier enzyme and then produce some second messenger. All right, so this is something we saw, again, before. This should be a review. And muscarinic receptors are an example of metabotropic receptors. So if we just jump back to this previous image, we can see how these 2 receptors differ. So first of all, on the parasympathetic side, both these neurons secrete acetylcholine. This we know, all right? The first neuron is going to release acetylcholine, and it's going to bind to a nicotinic receptor. Because this is a nicotinic receptor, the receptor is also a channel. This would open up a cation channel, ions will rush into the neuron, and this will depolarize this postganglionic neuron and fire a second action potential here. The acetylcholine that is released from the postganglionic neuron will also bind to this muscarinic cholinergic receptor, but this will be a different type of response. All right, this will be a metabotropic response. And this is going to be a slower response on this effector tissue, depending on where the tissue is, whether it's heart, whether it's muscle, whether it's gland, adipose. All right, so basically, your nicotinic receptor produces a faster response. At this ganglia, we need a faster response. We don't need that second messenger, metabotropic. All we need is this second neuron to be depolarized and fire another action potential. When it does so, It releases some more acetylcholine at the neuroeffector junction, and that acetylcholine will bind to a different type of cholinergic receptor. This one is a metabotropic receptor. And this receptor, this second receptor, is going to have a much slower and varied response. This is where we bring about that whole cascade of events, where we have second messenger, our amplifier enzyme, and the effect here can differ depending on where exactly this receptor is. All right, so I hope this sort of illustrates the difference between these two receptors, your ionotropic receptor, which the example here is nicotinic, and your metabotropic receptor, which the example here is muscarinic.